By any measure, Anne Carroll Moore is a giant in the field of children's literature. She was the very first children's librarian, a position she herself created. Moore was born in 1871 in Maine and moved to New York to attend the librarian program at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. Influenced by a paper she'd heard read at the 1894 meeting of the American Library Association, Moore organized a children's reading room at Pratt. At this time, children under the age of 14 were often forbidden to enter public libraries. Inspired by the burgeoning kindergarten movement, Moore instead created a friendly space, especially for her pint-sized patrons. Her children's reading room featured scaled-down furniture, reading nooks, programming such as story times and puppet shows, and librarians committed to stocking the shelves with good books. On the day Moore opened this very first children's reading room at Pratt, a waiting line of children curved all around the block. Moore eventually moved on to the New York Public Library, where she oversaw the Central Children's Room, which opened in 1911. She managed to turn policy around so that children were allowed to take out books. By 1913, 1/3 of all the books borrowed from the New York Public Library system were children's books. Moore, however, had certain fixed ideas about what kinds of stories were suitable for children. She approved of fairy tales and fantasy, genres that stretch children's imaginations, and is credited with introducing Beatrix Potter, among others, to American readers. But she strongly disliked, even loathed, some books that have since become undisputed classics of children's literature. And because of her work, which also included book reviewing, Moore was a powerful gatekeeper who could damage sales and even ban certain children's books from the shelves of the New York Public Library. One of the children's writers Moore vehemently disliked was E.B. White. Moore's reaction to White's first children's book, Stuart Little, was hard to fathom, given the fact that she had urged him to write the book in the first place. Before Stuart Little was published in 1945, Moore had obtained the early page proof, and she wrote to White telling him she felt the novel was inconclusive and not affirmative. She argued that the novel was not fit for children to read. Stuart Little, she said, was unruly, and his story failed in every way to correspond to time-honored patterns for fantasy. Moore didn't stop there. She wrote to White's editor and insisted the book should not be published, and then followed up with a 14-page letter to White's wife, Catherine Sargent Angel White. Catherine was no pushover. She was a groundbreaking writer and for many years, the only female editor at The New Yorker. So when Moore urged Catherine to pressure her husband to cancel the book, Catherine ignored her. Fortunately, the Whites had enough cultural clout of their own to get Stuart Little noticed in the literary world, despite Moore's objections. But 7 years later, Moore popped up again to complain about what many readers consider E.B. White's masterpiece, Charlotte's Web. Moore praised other just-published children's books in her Roundup column, but then she turned to Charlotte's Web. She declared that she herself had grown up on a farm in Maine and conceded that White portrayed farm animals with great beauty and understanding. She liked the character of Fern, but thought her mother was an idiot. Then Moore committed the book critic's cardinal sin. She faulted White for not writing the book she would have written. Moore wrote, Fern, the real center of the book, is never developed. The animals never talk, they speculate. As to Charlotte, her magic and mystery require a different technique to create that lasting interest in spiders, which controls childish impulse to do away with them. Moore's disdain, by the way, wasn't exclusive to books by E.B. White. She absolutely loathed Margaret Weiss Brown's 1947 classic, Goodnight Moon. And this loathing carried weight. From 1947 through 1972, the New York Public Library system did not contain one single copy of Goodnight Moon. That was because Moore, who'd already been forced to retire by the time Goodnight Moon and, of course, Charlotte's Web were first published, still exerted such power at the New York Public Library that those books simply weren't ordered. I've gone into Moore's story because she was such a powerful figure, mostly for good, in the emerging professionalization of children's literature as a genre in the 20th century. But I also want Moore's story to remind us that the banning of books, any kind of books, can happen undercover, so to speak. We know about Anne Carroll Moore's extreme prohibitions because of her prominence as a librarian. But there's no way to know how many times books have been and continue to be quietly exiled from library shelves because someone with a bit of power takes offense. As we continue with this lecture, focusing specifically on children's books we now consider classics, it's helpful to remember that the bannings I'm discussing are the ones we know about because they took place in the public sphere of school, PTA, and library board meetings.